In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union watched warily as tensions escalated in Europe. Joseph Stalin, from his Kremlin office, analyzed reports of Nazi Germany's aggressive moves. The scent of tobacco lingered as he pondered alliances and threats. Stalin was acutely aware of Adolf Hitler's disdain for communism, yet he sought to avoid direct confrontation, hoping to buy time to strengthen the Soviet military. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov shook hands with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop under the ornate chandeliers of the Kremlin. Stalin believed this pact would keep the USSR safe from German invasion, giving him a buffer period. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, a move Stalin saw as securing Soviet borders. As dawn broke on September 17, 1939, Soviet troops crossed into eastern Poland, following Germany's invasion from the west. The chill of early autumn filled the air as soldiers marched forward. Stalin viewed this as reclaiming territories lost during the turmoil following World War I. He considered it a strategic necessity to push the Soviet frontier westward, creating a buffer zone against potential aggressors. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland after failed negotiations over border security. Soviet soldiers trudged through the deep snow, facing fierce Finnish resistance. Stalin underestimated the Finns' resolve and overestimated his army's readiness. The harsh winter and heavy losses forced him to rethink his military strategies. The eventual peace treaty granted the USSR some territory, but at a high cost, revealing weaknesses in Soviet military leadership. Stung by the difficulties faced in Finland, Stalin focused on modernizing the Red Army. The corridors of the Kremlin echoed with discussions about tank production and troop training. He ordered the production of the T-34 tank and invested in Air Force development. Stalin was determined to prepare for any future conflicts, aware that the non-aggression pact with Germany might not last. Throughout early 1941, Soviet intelligence received reports of German troop buildups along the western border. Agents warned of a potential invasion. Stalin, however, was skeptical, believing Hitler would not risk a two-front war. He thought these were provocations or misinformation. The warm spring air did little to ease his growing unease, but he chose caution over immediate action. At dawn, on June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union along a vast front. The roar of aircraft and the thunder of artillery shattered the quiet morning. Stalin was reportedly shocked, retreating into isolation for several days. He may have thought about the betrayal and his miscalculations. The invasion marked a critical turning point, thrusting the USSR into the heart of World War II. German forces rapidly advanced, capturing vast territories and encircling Soviet armies. Cities fell one after another under the relentless assault. The Red Army was in disarray, suffering from purges of its leadership in the late 1930s. Stalin recognized the dire situation and knew that immediate drastic measures were needed to halt the enemy's progress. On July 3, 1941, Stalin addressed the Soviet people via radio. His voice carried a tone of resolute determination as he called for a great patriotic war against the invaders. He appealed to patriotism, urging unity across ethnic and political lines. This speech aimed to rally the nation, and he may have hoped it would strengthen morale and inspire resistance. As Soviet forces retreated, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy to deny the Germans resources. Fields were burned, factories dismantled, and supplies destroyed. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as villages were evacuated and set ablaze. Stalin believed this harsh tactic was necessary to hinder the enemy's advance, sacrificing land to preserve the nation's future. German forces encircled Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, initiating a siege that would last 872 days. Inside the city, residents faced starvation and relentless bombardment. Stalin was determined to hold the city at all costs, understanding its symbolic and strategic importance. He may have grappled with the human cost, but saw no alternative but to endure. As German troops advanced toward Moscow, panic gripped the capital. Snow began to fall as winter approached. Stalin decided to stay in the city, a move intended to bolster confidence. He ordered fresh divisions from Siberia, previously held back due to fears of Japanese aggression. Stalin was resolute, believing that holding Moscow was crucial for Soviet survival. In December 1941, the Red Army launched a counter-offensive near Moscow. Soviet troops, accustomed to harsh winters, pushed back the Germans ill-prepared for the cold. The howling winds and freezing temperatures became allies. Stalin felt vindicated in his decision to defend the capital and saw this as a turning point. He may have thought about the potential to shift momentum in their favor. The United States extended aid to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease Act. Supplies like trucks, food, and raw materials began arriving. Stalin recognized the importance of this support, though he remained wary of Western intentions. He may have considered how to leverage this assistance without becoming dependent, balancing gratitude with strategic caution. In 1942, Hitler shifted focus to the oil-rich Caucasus region. German forces advanced towards Stalingrad and the Volga River. Stalin understood that losing this area would cripple the Soviet war effort. The heat of the summer sun beat down as he ordered the defense of Stalingrad at any cost, turning the city into a fortress. The Battle of Stalingrad commenced with intense bombing raids. The city became a rubble-strewn battlefield. Soldiers fought street by street, house by house. Stalin's order, not a step back, reflected his determination. He may have felt the weight of history, knowing that this battle could decide the fate of the Soviet Union. Conditions in Stalingrad were brutal. The stench of death permeated the air as soldiers and civilians endured constant shelling. Supplies were scarce, and the Volga River crossings were perilous. Stalin monitored the situation closely, demanding regular updates. He may have been consumed by the desire to hold the city bearing his name, seeing it as a personal and national symbol. On November 19, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a counter-offensive aiming to encircle German forces in Stalingrad. The plan was audacious, attacking the weaker Romanian and Hungarian flanks. Stalin approved the operation, likely understanding the risks, but believing the potential rewards justified them. The encirclement trapped over 250,000 Axis troops. After months of siege, the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, surrendered. The frigid winter winds blew through the devastated city as Soviet soldiers celebrated. Stalin saw this victory as a turning point. He may have thought about the boost to Soviet morale and the shift in international perception. The victory at Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Anticipating a German offensive at Kursk, Stalin ordered the construction of deep defensive lines. The summer air was thick with tension as the largest tank battle in history unfolded. Soviet forces successfully repelled the Germans. Stalin was pleased with the effective use of intelligence and planning. He may have felt confident that the tide of war was turning irreversibly in their favor. Following victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army began pushing westward. Villages and cities were liberated amid scenes of destruction and hardship. The soldiers were fueled by a desire for revenge and justice. Stalin focused on maintaining momentum, perhaps contemplating the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany and the future balance of power in Europe. Stalin met with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt in Tehran. The warm climate contrasted with the tense discussions. Stalin pressed for the opening of a second front in Western Europe to alleviate pressure on Soviet forces. He may have been calculating how to secure Soviet interests post-war, recognizing the importance of diplomacy alongside military efforts. After nearly 900 days, the siege of Leningrad was lifted. The city's population had suffered immensely from starvation and bombardment. Stalin acknowledged the endurance of its people. He might have reflected on the sacrifices made and the propaganda value of their resilience, using it to further galvanize the Soviet populace. As Soviet forces moved into Eastern Europe, they liberated countries from Nazi occupation. The soldiers witnessed both gratitude and apprehension from locals. Stalin saw an opportunity to expand Soviet influence. He likely considered how to establish friendly governments, securing a buffer zone against future threats. In 1943, the Germans announced the discovery of mass graves of Polish officers in Katyn Forest, blaming the Soviets. Stalin denied responsibility. He may have been concerned about the impact on relations with the Allies and the Polish government in exile. Controlling the narrative became crucial to maintaining alliances and Soviet credibility. The Polish Home Army launched an uprising against German occupation in Warsaw. Soviet forces halted their advance nearby. Stalin decided not to assist immediately, possibly calculating that the defeat of non-communist Polish forces would make it easier to establish a pro-Soviet government. The city's destruction weighed heavily on international relations. In the Crimean resort of Yalta, Stalin met again with Churchill and Roosevelt. Discussions centered on post-war Europe's reorganization. The scent of the sea mixed with cigar smoke as they negotiated borders and spheres of influence. Stalin aimed to secure Soviet interests, insisting on friendly governments in Eastern Europe. He may have thought about how to balance cooperation with the Allies and his expansionist goals. As 1945 progressed, the Red Army pushed toward Berlin. Soldiers advanced through devastated landscapes, the remnants of war evident everywhere. Stalin was intent on capturing Berlin before the Western Allies, seeing it as a matter of prestige and strategic advantage. He may have felt urgency and competitiveness, pushing his generals for speed. The final assault on Berlin was brutal. Urban combat raged as Soviet troops fought street by street. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of artillery. Stalin monitored the battle closely, demanding updates. He may have considered the symbolic importance of taking Berlin, viewing it as the ultimate victory over Nazism. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. News reached Stalin, who was cautious about accepting it without confirmation. On May 8th, Germany officially surrendered. Celebrations erupted in Moscow, with fireworks lighting up the night sky. Stalin addressed the nation, acknowledging the immense sacrifices made. He likely felt a mixture of relief and contemplation about the immense task of post-war reconstruction. Stalin met with new U.S. President Harry S. Truman and Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee, in Potsdam, Germany. The atmosphere was tense, with discussions about demilitarization, reparations, and boundaries. Stalin sought to solidify Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He may have been wary of the changing dynamics, especially with the US's new leadership and the development of atomic weapons. In August 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Stalin was informed of the weapon's existence at Potsdam, but was surprised by its use. He may have felt a mix of concern over nuclear capabilities and opportunity to advance Soviet positions in Asia. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan, moving into Manchuria swiftly. Soviet forces advanced into Japanese-held territories in Manchuria, Korea, and the Kuril Islands. The operation was swift and effective. Stalin aimed to secure Soviet interests in the Far East. He may have thought about balancing relations with Western allies while expanding influence, anticipating post-war geopolitical shifts. The Soviet Union faced massive devastation, with millions dead and vast areas destroyed. Factories lay in ruins, and cities were leveled. Stalin prioritized rebuilding industry and infrastructure. He may have contemplated the challenges ahead, enforcing strict measures to accelerate recovery, often at great human cost. Stalin moved to solidify control over Eastern Europe by installing communist governments. The scent of new regimes filled the air as political opponents were suppressed. He likely saw this as essential for security, creating a buffer zone against future invasions. Stalin may have believed that only through control could the USSR prevent past tragedies from repeating. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946 highlighted the growing divide between East and West. Stalin dismissed the criticism publicly, but may have been aware of the deepening rift. He strengthened propaganda efforts and tightened control over information. The onset of the Cold War loomed, with Stalin positioning the Soviet Union as a superpower. In response to currency reforms in West Berlin, Stalin ordered the blockade of all ground access to West Berlin. The city became a focal point of East-West tensions. The Western Allies initiated the Berlin airlift to supply the city. Stalin may have hoped to force concessions, but ultimately lifted the blockade. This event intensified the Cold War dynamics. Aware of the US's nuclear monopoly, Stalin accelerated the Soviet atomic program. Scientists worked tirelessly in secret facilities. The successful test in 1949 leveled the playing field. Stalin likely felt vindicated, believing that nuclear capability was essential for security and international standing. In the early 1950s, Stalin's health declined, but his grip on power remained firm. Purges and political repression continued. He may have become increasingly paranoid, seeing enemies everywhere. The shadow of war still influenced his policies as he sought to strengthen the USSR against perceived threats. Stalin died on March 5, 1953. The nation entered a period of mourning. His death marked the end of an era defined by immense suffering and colossal achievements. The Red Army veterans reflected on their sacrifices. Stalin's legacy was complex. He had led the USSR through its greatest trial, but at an enormous cost. His thoughts remain a subject of study, but his impact on World War II and the shaping of the modern world is undeniable. Our journey through time comes to an end for today. We embark on new adventures every week. If you relish the experience, please like and subscribe.